maybe you can briefly tell us about OrthoCoPilot, what it is, just like a brief summary.
Yeah, sure. So it's an AI-based copilot for orthopedic physicians. So it's very specific to the field of orthopedics. And the goal is to leverage technology to make healthcare more personalized. So it supports doctors and their medical staff, but it also helps patients prepare better for their appointment.
That's nice. That's a really ambitious target group, actually. I think healthcare is such a nice space, and especially health tech is one of the fastest growing industries right now. Maybe let's start at the beginning. Like, what made you become an entrepreneur? How did you end up in the entrepreneurial space, and what are like the motives behind you becoming a founder?
So I remember it started quite early. When I read my first comics, I really liked the inventors. Every time there was an inventor in the comics, I liked that part. So when people asked me, what do you want to do in life? People said policeman, or sometimes people said cowboys, like when they were quite young still. I always said inventor, even though I had really no idea how you would earn money. You don't think about that when you're a kid. And then I hadn't thought about it during school. I think sometimes school has a way of like killing the entrepreneurial spirit because it's very rigid and you follow certain rules and structures. So the first time I thought about it again was during university, when I studied and you got in touch again with entrepreneurs, especially at the technical university, but also at the LMU. And through that, step by step, I got back into the entrepreneurial ecosystem, and I started working for a startup as my first full-time job. And that's how actually I stayed in the startup scene during my entire professional life.
Nice. What kind of startup was that? Like, what was the entry point?
So it was a digital health startup.
Oh, wow.
And so during my studies, I was one of those students who was not really present during the lectures. I always worked next to my studies, and I tried out different things. Because I wanted to know what to do once the studies are done, right? So I worked for a large corporate, Wirecard, for example, and not the
that was something.
yeah, not the most renowned name nowadays. But I worked for a foundation, NGO, and the only thing I hadn't tried was a startup. And so I applied for a digital health startup because half of my family are doctors and nurses and care providers. So, at the dinner table, a lot of the times they talked about healthcare. And so I always had this sort of interest in healthcare. And that's why I applied for a digital health startup.
Nice. So you had a personal connection to healthcare, and probably like it helped you a lot to get into the perspective of somebody who's within the medical field. So how did you meet your future or your co-founders? What happened there? I've seen that they're both from the medical domain. They studied medicine, right?
Yeah.
How did you meet, and what happened there?
Yeah. So I met them through a program called Health Innovation Program at the Technical University in Munich. It's organized also by TUM Venture Labs Healthcare. And they have a very strong ecosystem for startups and entrepreneurs. And in that program, clinical partners present challenges to students and young professionals. At the time, I was a bit younger. And then you can apply to that challenge, and they form groups to solve that challenge. And I thought back then, it was the first batch. It was still very early, everything. I thought that it was the first challenge that I saw, and the only one during that batch that I thought could actually be solved with this group of people, right? Because if you're talking about students and young professionals, those are typically rather inexperienced individuals, and they might be super motivated. But as doctors, you don't have that much time to really train them and teach them about everything there is to know. And I thought, okay, this is a challenge that is solvable. And so let's apply there. And that's how I met them.
Nice. And did they give you like a pre-formulated problem that you had to solve, or what happened there?
Yeah. So they already formulated a problem. Of course, we pivoted a little bit since then.
Yeah.
They started with a rather narrow problem, or actually two problems. And then bit by bit, we discovered that actually this is a whole chain of problems that we need to solve. And it needs to be solved by the same software. I think, and this is something that is very important in healthcare, is that most of the time the people that see the problems and that have the idea for the solutions are the providers themselves. It's rare that, because it's so complicated, it's rare that there is an outsider that comes in that has no idea how healthcare works, that has the right idea.
Especially in health tech. I see
Especially in
that a
health
lot.
tech.
I have a lot of friends who are now young doctors, and I hear from them all the time exactly that the field of medicine needs renovation. They need tech within the domain, but the domain is so complex that from an outside perspective, someone who only studied business administration, for example, and has no idea about medicine, it's really difficult for them to get immersed by that field and to know everything that is relevant to start up a business there. Did your background help you there to get the connection to know what the people are talking about?
Definitely. So I worked a lot with different kinds of healthcare providers, whether it's doctors, then doctors, of course, means doctors in practices, doctors in clinics, doctors in the lab, whether it's medical staff that supports doctors in their work, or other kinds of providers like pharma, for example. But the overarching theme is always they see a problem and they know the solution, but they don't necessarily have the digital competency. They don't necessarily have the regulatory competency, since healthcare is a highly regulated market. They don't necessarily also have the business acumen, right? Like, how do I monetize it? How do I make sure that it's sustainable and it grows over time?
That is scalable. That's what I see a lot. Like, some of my friends were telling me stories on what they could improve, but then it would be a one-fit solution and it's not scalable. So it's really difficult to make a business out of that.
Correct. Sometimes the answer is it's not scalable. So, but that doesn't mean that it cannot become a profitable business. Maybe it's just an SME. It's small, medium-sized. It grows organically, slowly, and it's maybe not a VC-funded startups, right? We forget that 99% of companies are actually not VC-funded startups, and they can still be successful, and they're the backbone of the economy.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe let's rewind a little bit. You were briefly talking about your co-founders. For all the people who are interested in building a startup, what should they look for in their co-founders?
So ideally, it's people that you like, that you have sympathy for because you spend a lot of time together. But also you go through a lot of situations where there is tension and there is potential conflict. So you need to have that underlying trust, right? That is sort of the infrastructure for everything that you operate with. So this, I would say, on a personal level. On a professional level, you need someone that understands what you're talking about to some degree, but more than that, brings in some level or some area of competence that you don't own yourself. So for us, for example, Dr. Marco Rupp brings the medical knowledge and also the clinical knowledge. So it's not just purely medical know-how, but it's also how does a clinic work? How does a doctor's practice work? And that's the know-how that he brings. And I bring more of the how do you develop a digital health solution? What do you need to plan in terms of regulation? How do you monetize it? But I have seen clinics and practices work. So when he says something, I understand him. And because he's a rather innovative doctor, he has had different innovation projects in the past that he worked on, also as a strategy consultant at McKinsey. He understands when I say things easier than if I talk to a doctor who has maybe spent their entire life in medicine.
So overlapping perspectives are key to have like a base where you talk about. So if you drop some words that are like a little bit more niche, then other people understands the word. Maybe the other person doesn't know what it exactly means, but he knows or she knows in which direction it goes.
Ideally, yes. That's the state that you should drive towards. If it's not there in the very beginning, I think you can build it, but then it's important to build that.
Yeah. Speaking of the problem, what was the problem that's underlying OrthoCoPilot?
Yeah. So the problem are actually many small problems, because in the so-called patient journey, so from the beginning of a patient feels that they need a doctor all the way to the treatment is completed, there are many steps, right, along the patient journey. And at each step, there are small or medium-sized inefficiencies that accumulate. And because of the accumulation of all those inefficiencies, they bring, providers to a breaking point, because they diminish their revenue, they drive up their cost, They are extremely annoying, so they decrease satisfaction of doctors and medical staff that work there. And also patients, they get appointments delayed, or sometimes they're not prepared for their appointment. Their care is not as good as it could have been because it doesn't align with their expectations. So actually, it's many problems that accumulate and that make care worse than it could be. It could be way, way better.
And then you started to develop a solution that addresses some of those problems, right? Where did you start? What was the starting point for that?
So initially, we started with one very specific inefficiency. And then over time, we said, oh my God, there are so many of them. And the solution is actually the same for all of them. The first inefficiency that we targeted was the anamnesis process. So when patients come in, usually, the first touch point is on the phone. When they make the appointment over email, they say, maybe I have a pain here and there. That's the first indication that you have. And then you get an appointment. Then they come in, they fill out an anamnesis. Maybe they have some medical documentation, maybe not. So half of the documentation is there, the other half isn't. And then they fill out the anamnesis, often still by hand. So you may not be able to read it. Maybe they skip a few questions. Even if it's digital, usually it's just the question and the answer, right? It's not visualized in a way that would be helpful to the doctor. Then the doctor gets that information sheet with basically questions and answers. They have a couple of seconds to go through it, and then they go into the consultation. And what happens during the consultation is a lot of the times they have to ask questions again because they weren't able to read the information, because some of it wasn't filled out, because the information was presented in a way that doesn't allow the doctor to really understand the problem and what he needs to or she needs to ask next. So during the appointment, the patient starts talking. And doctors don't have that kind of time. They have to see 30 to 50 patients a day. So if I tell you, I broke my leg and it hurts here, that's a good summary. If I say, I tripped over the cat of my husband in the kitchen, and then I hurt my knee so bad, and then my husband came in and he asked me whether I'm fine. That's too much information and it's time consuming. And that was one of the first problems they wanted to solve.
Okay, nice. And what was your first starting point to solve that? Did you develop some kind of questionnaire? Did you go in dialogue with doctors and patients, or how did you start?
So we started basically by mapping our co-founders' medical brain. We said, okay, what questions would you ask? And then depending on their answers, what questions would you ask next? So we developed a dynamic questionnaire that is basically a logic tree. And depending on your answer, we will ask you different questions next. That was the first part. So it was a structured way of asking information from the patient before the consultation. And the second thing we did, and I think that's maybe the more important part or the thing that sets us a bit apart, a lot of anamnesis solutions today simply ask a question and then they retrieve the answer and then display the answer. We thought about how can we visualize that information that we captured so that the doctor can really in 10 seconds grasp the case and be prepared for the appointment and really focus on navigating the conversation during the appointment to where he or she wants to go, rather than saying, okay, what's your problem? And then this is a big open question. The patient, some patients will be really concise and others will talk for 15 minutes about everything, but, the actual problem that the doctor wants to know.
Of course. And then you tested that solution in form of a really small MVP, right?
Yeah. So we built a prototype and we piloted it at the TUM Sport Orthopedics department at the University Clinic here in Munich with 60 patients and 4 doctors for 4 weeks. We only focused on knee. So we only mapped one questionnaire and it worked really well. So doctors said they felt better prepared for the appointment. They were able to guide the patient better through the consultation much faster, so they saved time. And the documentation that we provided helped as a reference point in the future for the diagnostic and treatment procedure. And patients said they felt better prepared because they went through a structured questionnaire. So they thought about their case before they went into the appointment in a structured manner, right? So they didn't feel like they missed out. They felt like their doctor was better prepared because the conversation wasn't wild. It was very structured and to the point and clear. And so it left more room and more time for patients to ask questions that maybe they wanted to have answered before the appointment was over.
Mm-hmm. That sounds great. Did you have like a structured approach based on data, and then you analyze that data, and from there you move to the next step, or how did you proceed with your findings from the first MVP?
So we gathered a lot of user feedback, both from patients and from doctors. We had an voluntary questionnaire at the end of the anamnesis. So this had to be short because obviously if you have already a questionnaire for your anamnesis and then a second questionnaire about how you like the product, that's quite annoying.
Of course.
But we tried to get into an increasing level of details depending on the findings that we had. Over the course of the 4 weeks, we changed sort of the questionnaire. And we found out a lot about how the product needs to change. And based on that, we created user designs. So basically, how would a next level of that product look like based on the feedback that we got? And we went into interviews again with doctors and patients. And this is sort of an iterative process that we did. I want to really stress the point of we did designs, because in healthcare, especially when you talk to doctors, but also when you talk to patients, you're often talking about things that are so abstract that if you don't provide something tangible and something visual that people can see or touch, they will have a hard time imagining what your solution is, right? So that's why we provided user designs and we said, this is how the solution would look like. Would you use it if it works this way or that way? And then we sort of improved the designs over time. And the helpful thing is that way we also planned our product in parallel, right?
Nice, yeah. That resonates a lot with me because I'm also a UX designer. So that approach is, from my perspective, like one of the best that you can take. Like taking small steps, iterating, testing them with like a wireframe or with anything that helps the user to see how it might be how it might look like. That's probably an approach in entrepreneurship, but also in design of digital software,
Yeah.
of course. One question that came into my mind is like medicine is a highly regulated area and you're handling complex data of patients. How difficult was it for you to work in that space as a startup?
So it is extremely cumbersome. If you have no experience in that field, or if you have no experience with GDPR, so General Data Protection Regulations in Europe, or data security, then you will have a hard time because there is a lot to learn. Thankfully, I have a lot of experience in that field and talk about complementing competencies, right?
Yeah.
So I was able to guide us through many of the main challenges that we would have. What we did is we kept everything local. So there was nothing in the cloud, which makes things much easier. We anonymized all of the data because we didn't need names and birth dates, and we just needed age brackets, maybe that's medically relevant. So all of those steps. But of course, it's still cumbersome because when you have a team working on a new AI module, for example, for diagnosis prediction based on patient data, then they have to go to a local office every time they work on this, right? So remote work is not an option with this, for example. So we had the experience how we had to navigate it, but some things remain cumbersome.
Of course, it's a really highly complex field. What happened next? Like you built your prototype. What happened after that? How did you proceed?
So through the Health Innovation Program, we had, I think, €1,500 in budget. And because we participated twice, we got a total amount of €3,000, which is not a lot, right?
No.
So we got two really motivated but extremely junior developers from Indonesia. You can imagine, the different time zones. Then the English level was, so. So the communication was hard. They were really junior, so they made a lot of mistakes. So it was really, really annoying to build that first prototype. And especially when you work with doctors and patients, it's a very unforgiving group of users. Trust is earned. Trust and credibility is hard earned and easily lost in healthcare. Thankfully, these were colleagues of Dr. Marco Rupp, which is my co-founder. And so he prepared them and he managed the expectations really, really well, I have to say. But also they were very tolerant and very patient with us. So I have to say thank you to any doctor who might be listening to this podcast that used our first prototype. Thank you for your patience. Which, by the way, is a tip for all the entrepreneurs or want to be entrepreneurs that are listening. Find a very forgiving pilot partner because you will need them at the beginning to be very tolerant and patient with you. So we did that, and that brought us sort of far enough to be able to apply for AI Plus Munich, now AI Nation, and that helped us win 20,000 euro in a prototyping grant, which allowed us to build our MVP, which is what we're currently finalizing now, so that we can do an actual clinical study with the university clinic. And this time we're talking about a far more polished, far more stable, richer in features product than we used to, right? And so I think that's the second tip is you don't necessarily need to get everything the way it's in your head right away. You won't be able to because you won't have the resources. You have to think very carefully about the milestones you set over the next 2-3 years and what a goal do you have to achieve as a next goal to be able to unlock the resources for the second milestone.
So basically like having a vision in the future, but going step by step, because each step new problems come up that you didn't even think of before because you couldn't, because like it's becoming more complex the more you dive into the topic.
Right. So it gets more complicated, but also I think you want two things, right? You want resources to be able to build this, but also you want to decide yourself whether you keep on putting time and emotions into this, right? And work and effort. I think there are many startup ideas where no one is going to tell you this is enough. Like you have tried everything, right? How do you know yourself when to stop? I think the worst thing is not to fail. I think that's sometimes beyond your control. I think the worst thing is to spend time on something that you could have known earlier that is not going to work out. And then you spend years on that one thing that if you had thought about it carefully in the beginning, you would have known that, okay, this is not something I want to pursue further. And it's never binary. It's never, yes, I pursue this, or no, I don't pursue this because the world tells me no. You always have to make a decision at each step. Have I made sufficient progress? I have to be honest with myself. Have I made sufficient progress for me to continue this? Or are the results not there for me? It's always also a personal decision to say, no, I don't continue this further. No one will tell you, don't do this anymore because you have failed, right? It's not a computer game where you either pass or don't pass.
That's true. So it's kind of like a zoom out, zoom in thing. Like you have to zoom out, you have to plan, you have to have like an idea on how it should look like, what might be risks, what might be opportunities that come up, but then zoom in into the actual working moment and come up with the solution on the spot.
Right.
An interplay between the two views, right?
Yeah.
That's from how I imagined it as well. If you were when you were in the AI Plus Munich program and you received like that fund, how did you use it? Like, what do you think are the best areas to spend money if you get like equity-free money for programs like that?
I think it really depends where in the stage you are and sort of what do you need to build next, right? So we talked just now about setting milestones and then what do you need to unlock the next milestones? For us, it was clear that if we want more funding and more resources to be able to go further in our journey, we need to have an MVP. We need to have a clinical study that says, yes, this works and this actually saves time because it gives you credibility in the market. And we also knew that to convince commercial pilot partners, we would need this academic evidence. And then we would be able to convince commercial partners to do also a pilot with us and then get our first paying customers. So we use that money for two things. The majority of it we used to build a stable product that we can actually do a clinical study with and that we don't need to be ashamed of when we go to commercial partners to do a pilot. And a smaller portion of the money we used to talk about regulatory topics with consultancies, specifically about the medical device regulation, which is a regulation that governs medical software in healthcare. There is the MDR in Europe, and then there is the FDA in the US, two big bodies that are important to know in the Western markets. And there it's, 5,000 euros, what we allocated as a budget for that. That's not enough to get enough regulatory advice to really plan your product through. But it's enough to understand how long will the certification process takes, which parts of my product will be subject to the MDR, and how much will it cost me. And this is important because for my business case planning, I need to know by when will I be able to commercialize my product. I won't be able to commercialize it before it's certified, which pushes revenues into the future. And how much will it cost me to develop it, which means what cost am I going to incur until I'm able to commercialize. And that obviously is important for my financial planning, which is important for my fundraising.
Of course. So you developed a POC, a proof of concept, right, with a clinical study. How did it look like? What were the most important aspects of that POC? How did it help you to get through to your first pilot customer?
So the pilot we did with the university clinic, that was in October. So that one is done. And this was really a pilot where we just asked subjectively, how did it make you feel? Or were you satisfied? Did you feel like you were better prepared? Now we're doing an actual clinical study that sort of meets the academic standards of the clinical study, where we also measure things like how much time did it save. So we have two groups, right? One group that uses the solution, one group that doesn't. Can we show that appointment time is shorter? Or can we show that within the same appointment time, we put in more information, a better exchange, whatever it is? So those are the endpoints that we are going to measure. The clinical study hasn't started yet because the MVP is not completely done. We're finishing it this month.
Nice.
And I'm happy to tell you how it went.
Yeah, that would be really nice to get an update on that. Maybe we can find an insight for new founders in there as well. There's many features that you could test on. Did you have like a framework to decide what feature or what area the clinical study should focus on?
Yeah, definitely. So we did a lot of interviews, both with doctors and with patients, but also with medical staff, which is one of the user groups. So we did interviews with everybody that works along that value chain. And we decided, first of all, which users should even use that kind of product. Second, what features would they care about based on the interviews that we did? And then we really focused on the couple of features that we were also able to do with our budget, first of all. But second, you don't want to overload a user with a new solution, right? So I think there is this naive view sometimes on software that you just introduce the software into your organization and done, right? Now I'm digitized. And that's not how it works. The way it works is you introduce a new piece of software, and now you have to adapt the way that you work, the structures and processes and your attitude towards certain things so that you can really benefit from it. Which means that not only did we have user interviews to discuss which features to put in the MVP, but also we are going to put a lot of emphasis on training people to use the software so that they can reach the maximum benefit. Because if the clinical study fails, we don't want it to be because the software could have helped, but people didn't know how to use it, or felt overwhelmed by it because they didn't get proper training at the beginning. And that's, I think, something where a lot of startups also fail. They build a great product, but then they fail to help users get onboarded to it.
Yeah, that's true. Like I've heard it a lot, actually. What you mentioned. OrthoCoPilot. Tell us a little bit more about like the solution that you've built right now. What are the main features? Maybe run us through like a small user journey on someone who uses your product.
Okay. So
thanks for joining us for the first part of this episode. We hope you enjoyed the discussion so far. If you're ready to keep the conversation going, part 2 is already available right here in the playlist. We appreciate you listening, and we can't wait to have you back for the rest of the story.